thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's our first chance to be on the campus of Baylor University. I thank Randall for giving us opportunities to come and inviting us. I was curious when you had your last meeting as to what all was accomplished and what you've done. Look at today. The subject of our area for discussion here is equipping students with modern skills, balancing traditional standards and cultural demands. So I began asking myself the question: equipping students, modern skills, balancing traditional standards and cultural demands. So as I read the title for this presentation, questions of why, how, when, where, how come, and who immediately began to challenge my own thinking. So I'm going to do my best to get done in 20 minutes here. I kept telling Randall, I don't know if I can. I slipped out of the movie time last night, not because I didn't want to spend the time with you guys, but I went home and I started cutting my material. And I finally said, well, you know what, if I go 25 minutes, please forgive me. I'm going to do my best to slide through this quickly. But I want to ask some real serious questions I think that sometimes I'm afraid to ask. And I think that maybe we can come to this table and at the end of the day, if we don't answer all the questions, then so be it, but at least we put it on the table. I deeply love equipping students, especially as worshipers of the Most High God. I never seem to lose the wonder of how my lecture or teaching can trigger an aha moment in the life of a student as they stand at the intersection of real-life need and practical education, and the traffic light of reality flashes, go, caution, stop, or change directions. It's with a sense of amazement that I see how God has allowed each generation of skilled musicians to become part of this greater plan of redemption, and that people of all ages answer the call to worship the God of the ages. And I'm mystified at how each generation taps into the use of modern skills. I'm certain that the modern skills for communicating during the 1880 Moody Sankey revivals were as fascinating to that generation as the use of technology, communication, and information are for those of us in influential positions of worship leadership training today. And as a student of worship history, especially the unwritten story of more recent history, I'm keenly aware of the need to value traditions and academic and ecclesiastical standards and denominational nuances. I am stunned at how culture shapes what we are, and I am equally intrigued at the reality that culture has always influenced the way we practice worship, prescribe learning outcomes for worship pedagogy, establish preferences for worship expression, and promote the various personalities associated with the worship leadership. Some here may know the name Bob McKenzie. He was a record producer and A&R director for the Benson Company during the formative days of what we now call the Christian music industry. I read in Bill Gaither's autobiography, It's More Than the Music, that Bob McKenzie had profound influences on Bill and Gloria Gaither's life and career. Gaither says, to Bob McKenzie, the why question was most important. So may I suggest as we discuss our mission to equip worship leaders that it's time for us to ask the why question. Why do we do what we do? And how does the authenticity of our own personal callings intersect with the reality of equipping the next generation of worship leaders? I want to thank Randall Bradley for giving us that copy of From Memory to Imagination, Reforming the Church's Music. His book is part of the Calvin Institute of Christian Liturgical Studies series, and I'm especially intrigued with its chapters, Why We're in the Crisis Now, The Mess We're In, and The Call to Be Missional. Randall was asking some really important and tough questions about the way we worship and the way we teach others to worship. So let me quote from his introduction. I spent the time I needed to be working on this thing, reading big books, what happened. The changes that have occurred in church music in the latter part of the 20th century are continually calling for the church's music leaders to redefine their philosophy related to music's function in worship. I even have this up there for us. Questioning by all involved in Christian music must happen in order for progress to take place. Philosophies long held to be true are breaking down in unlikely places. There is need for prophetic voices to lead these discussions. And I want to take it and go to a prophetic voice that I think can actually augment what Randall is saying. And this is from A.W. Tozer. There is no limit to what can be done if it doesn't matter who gets the credit. And no man is worthy to succeed until he is willing to fail. And no man is morally worthy of success in religious activities until he is willing that the honor of succeeding should go to another if God so wills. So it's in this very spirit that I want us to consider the subject today. I'm going to ask some tough questions. And most of my questions will center in on the state of church music education in the evangelical culture. Some questions will deal with standards for evaluation. I'm not sure how many of the questions are really appropriate at a meeting like this, but the questions need to be asked nonetheless. And at the end of the day, we may not have many answers, but at least a dialogue has been initiated that may better help us equip our students as lead worshipers, fully equipped to do kingdom work. So would you take your notes? I've passed them out here, and help us ask the questions. So you received a handout today, and listed in each box are a series of questions followed by a series of blank lines for you to use. As I make this presentation, would you please write down your own questions for discussion, so that when we do discuss a little later, we really can articulate better, maybe shape this conversation in a way that is practical for our institutions. But before we begin asking too many questions, let's first take a brief look at recent history. It was not until the late 1940s and early 50s that the evangelical colleges began graduating students strategically trained as musicians, worship leaders, or song directors to serve the evangelical church. But even then, it was another decade before evangelical communities en masse began securing full-time professionals as music pastors or directors or whatever you want to call them. And by 1990, extrinsic influences began to erode the confidence pastors had in finding trained music and worship personnel for local churches. These influences include, but are not limited to, and I've given those here for you, the praise and worship music movement, sometimes called a worship awakening. The baby boomers were now middle-aged, and their children emerged as the X generation. The Christian music industry had come of age and was making important contributions to music literature used in the local church. And the information age brought new technology and, of course, the internet. And the mega churches emerged with new dynamic opportunities for musicians. And the seeker-sensitive or purpose-driven churches influenced growth strategies and worship practices. So that by 2000, the evangelical church experienced yet another far-reaching paradigm shift. Change was the rule of thumb. The postmodern demand for experience, coupled with commitment to sincerity, emerged. A new millennial generation began to take center stage, and pastors and church leaders, once loyal to their favorite Christian colleges or seminaries for finding personnel equipped to lead worship, began turning to other resources. So that's the first question I want us to ask. What are these questions, and how are we going to answer them? So let's talk about equipping worship students. I remember hearing of one well-known evangelical music department hosting a summit-type meeting with their faculty and area worship pastors for the sole purpose of discussing the need for training musicians as worship leaders. Suggestions and recommendations of this meeting came directly from the university chancellor. Not everybody attending was excited about the prospects of such a discussion. So as the meeting started and the moderator concluded with the opening prayer, one of the longtime tenured music faculty barked out the question, well, do we give the students what they want, or we give them what they need? To which one of the invited ministers of music attending the meeting quickly replied, that's the wrong question. To say this was a contentious meeting is an understatement. Well, what questions should we ask? Maybe these questions will help us get started. For example, what purposes are we equipping students? And is our primary goal to equip our students for ministry or music? What role do local pastors have in helping us shape worship curricula? Are we teaching our church music and worship students to think as innovators and communicators of biblical truth? Or why are the number of students involved in church music programs declining at well-established, well-respected schools of music? Is the worship leader a musician, a theologian, a disciple, a pastor, a counselor, a staff member, a mentor, a producer, a lover of people, a leader, a servant leader? I would suggest that there's an ample argument that the role of the worship leader includes all of these. So is there criteria, or is there a model for teaching and training worship leaders? And finally, are we really equipping students to meet the diverse demands of the 21st century leaders? So that leads us to the second set of questions, modern skills. Through these paradigm shifts, the role of the worship leader has become more defined. Today, pastors and church leadership look for worship leaders equally skilled as musicians, videographers, producers, and communicators of theology. None of this is new to you. I know that. But what questions do we need to ask when developing curricula for the training of worship pastors and skilled practitioners? So let me begin by asking these questions. What skills are we required to develop? And what is the process for developing worship skills? Or do we teach communication skills? Or is this something better left up to the communications professors? Or do we as musicians and artists teach worship theology? Or is this something better left up to the theology professors? Perhaps all here agree today that worship leaders need to be thoroughly versed in media technology and the latest presentation software and a hearty dose of Finale or Sibelius notation software. But what about people skills? And is it our job to teach students how to get along with the senior pastor, respond to the dynamic of an executive staff, deal with the unpredictable nature of a personnel committee? And what about the musical skills? All of us here agree that a good worship leader must be prepared to lead as a skilled musician. But what about music theory? What about the need of teaching Mozart to young aspiring keyboard players? Or what about the need to develop piano technique, vocal durability, or finger picking technique? And all of us would agree that as sufficiently qualified worship leaders, mastery of these musical skills are essential. But do we continue to teach music theory based on a model shaped and canonized by the common practice period? And what about teaching national numbers or jazz chords? Or are we teaching our students to master dictation skills well enough to successfully do takedowns off of CDs or their MP3 players? And do we teach musicians or students to write and compose music the old-fashioned way with a pencil and a sheet of manuscript paper? Or do we encourage them to use their innate play-by-ear abilities and create music with Logic, Finale, and GarageBand softwares? Or how do we teach harmonic analysis to a group of students committed to playing guitar with a series of sounds that escape true identity because a third of the chord is always missing? Maybe we get the gist of the series of questions I'm asking. Modern skills are exceptionally important, but we need to identify, articulate, scrutinize, prioritize, and codify which modern skills are essential for the next generation of worship leaders. That leads us to the third area, balancing traditional standards. Perhaps this is one of the most perplexing areas for evaluation, and the area I spent so much time on. Why? Because everyone has their own standard. Every one of us have watched worship wars erupt over the words traditional, contemporary, conservative, moderate, and liberal. It would seem natural then to ask the questions about the standards. So my first question is, what standard are we referring to when we want to balance traditional standards? Are we wanting to balance standards for church music and culture? Balance is very important. It brings perspective and it provides a platform for evaluation and growth. But my question is, in our effort to equip the worship leader, doesn't there need to be a balance between the preservation of old constructs for mastery and the presentation of new concepts for ministry? How does our standard for teaching worship match with our own biblical worldview? So what about the standard already established by what I'm going to call the old school church music curriculum? This approach to education is based on that idea that ministers of music and worship leaders must be exclusively trained as performers of classical music. As long as there are large churches wanting classically trained musicians to stand in their places of leadership, there continue to be a market for the traditional church music degree. But over the years, many pastors have moved from hiring traditional church musicians. They want personnel with a different skill set. In a reaction to the demands by these pastors, college presidents and administrators have pushed the church music departments, and I've been in one of those, to establish worship degree programs that focus less on music and more on Christian disciplines. College music chairs and directors of church music programs interpret their leadership as making demands for a dumbing down of their high music standards. And in response to this pressure, most church music departments raised the flag of NASM accreditation and they've resisted change. So let's ask the question, what about the standard established by the National Association of Schools of Music? Well, over the last 5 years, NASM member schools have struggled in finding a way to balance the standard of their own sacred music degrees with innovations of the emerging worship studies degrees. And during the last 2 national convention meetings, NASM has devoted day-long breakout sessions to discussions about new standards and degree names for those of us offering studies in the various worship disciplines. I've met several of you there. As a result, standards for worship study degrees have been developed, and member schools will now have the option of offering interdisciplinary Bachelor of Music degrees. Even with the wonderful and exciting gestures by NASM to include standards for the worship degrees, there still remains a large and potentially dangerous gap in articulating what areas of study should be included in the worship degree discipline. Do you suppose that our old school curriculum in church music has been equipping our students for the wrong market? What then is the standard for developing worship curricula in the evangelical tradition? It seems to me that the standard for training and equipping worship leaders varies from group to group, denomination to denomination, and institution to institution. Today, there are 90 colleges and universities boasting degrees in worship. When we started our degree in 2005, there were only 6. To my knowledge, there is not a norm upon which to build a standard worship curriculum. The sheer number of courses used in developing worship curricula from institution to institution is absolutely astonishing. Do you suppose it's time for us to assemble a coalition of institutions already already offering worship degrees and develop a set of standards that can serve as a curricular guide for all of the evangelical institutions? That leads me to the last area, cultural demands. This leads to the next question. And I ask this question with a great deal of sincerity. Are we equipping worship leaders to meet the rigors of 21st century culture? Which cultural demand are we referring to? Consider these statistics. In a 2011 survey of the National Association of Schools of Music member schools, there are only 377 undergraduate, 254 graduate, and 47 postgraduate students enrolled in sacred music, church music, or liturgical studies at 78 institution member schools. This is a total of 678 students studying some type of worship or music nationwide. Let me say it again. It's only 678 students studying some type of worship or church music nationwide. Last year, only 70 undergraduate, 78 graduate, and 8 doctoral students received degrees in church music from one of these member schools. So we divide that 678 number by the 78 member schools. It means that there are fewer than 9 students studying in church music programs at NASM accredited institutions nationwide. Why so few? According to our research at Liberty University, there are between 2,800 and 3,000 job openings for worship leaders, pastors, and support staff in the evangelical community alone. This doesn't count the Methodists, it doesn't count the Presbyterians, it doesn't count the mainline denominations. So why is it that those who employ church musicians are not quickly turning to many of our schools to find trained and equipped personnel? Consider these statistics. 61% of American population is under the age of 45. 22% are between the ages of 45 and 64. And only 13%, 40 million Americans, are over the age of 65. Do you suppose that pastors and church leaders perceive, and I don't mean that we do this, perceive that the vast majority of colleges and universities are offering degrees in church music that have been built on a curricular demographic for the age over 65? If 61% of the American population is under the age of 45, how do we expect to appeal to their spiritual, emotional, and artistic needs if our programs are primarily designed to accommodate a senior adult age? What role does pop culture have in helping us design culture that will meet the needs of this millennial generation? Does denominational culture have bearing on how worship curriculum is created? What about the issues of contextualization? And what about the notion that evangelicals, as evangelicals, we should recapture the arts for the kingdom? And how about this? How do we teach music to students of the millennial culture? I look out at the faces of my freshman class and see eager, passionate students that were born in 1993 and 1994. And I feel absolutely old. This generation has never gone without television, cell phones, or internet, and they never have used a manual typewriter. And it's this generation that communicates personal likes and dislikes and ambitions, fears, love languages, religions, religious convictions, and political references on Facebook and Twitter for everybody in the world to see. And yet it's the same students that isolate themselves from their peers and their instructors by plugging in their iPhones and their iPods and surrounding themselves with the music of their favorite worship parties. Their immediate authority for answers in life is Google, and they live for the moment. They want to be famous, and they have some strong opinions about every social issue. At least a third of this millennial students are coming into my classroom are from homes of divorced parents. And many are from single-parent homes. And they come to our classrooms wounded. And they seek to find meaning in life. The point is the challenge of teaching worship leading skills to this millennial generation is much deeper, much more complicated, and exceptionally more demanding than teaching them how to be musically and technologically savvy. In dealing with this millennial reality and the declining numbers of the church music program, one young, talented, and very bright church music educator at a sister school said, "Should we continue to guard the casket of tradition just so we can hold fast to the constructs that originally led us to create church music degrees?" Well, at first I heard this, I was a little bit offended. But my question is this: do we need to find creative ways to integrate tradition and all the good that we have, the way that we've done it all these years, into the larger evangelical marketplace? Can our old school church music curricula be shaped in such a way that market demands are actually met? So, let's see if I I think that's all the PowerPoint to get. All right. Amen. So how do we design a worship curriculum that would equip students to successfully accomplish what God has called them to do in the evangelical culture? Recently, in discussing this subject with a colleague, the comment was made, I get the impression that some educators are trying to sell us a 1968 Cadillac when most pastors want to secure a 2012 Chevy or a 2012 BMW. Then he continued, other educators are wanting to take that 68 Cadillac, put a 2012 body on it, and call it something new. But everything in the car was everything in the car was made for is still old, and that which makes it run in reality is outdated. Well, I remember talking to the director of a church music program at a well-known school at last year's NASM meeting about his new worship degree. He was totally excited and pumped about the progress their school had been experiencing. He said that the enrollment in the worship program had nearly tripled over a 12-month period by simply changing the names of their church music courses to worship. It is still the same degree it's always had. Not a thing has changed. They just changed the name. Well, I'm not sure this approach is going to have a long-term impact. Maybe in designing this worship curriculum in the car, if I can use that as a metaphor, it's time to go back to the drawing board. Let's start from the ground up. New frame, new chassis, new name, new wheels, new engine, new drivetrain, new body, and a new look. Do you remember when Lee Iacocca changed the name of the automobile company to the New Chrysler Company? He invented the K-car, which I never liked, and the minivan. Well, we have long since forgot the K-car, but I even own a new Chrysler minivan. Do you get the point? Second, may I suggest that we consider developing a model for curricular development that addresses the need of character building, integrity, spiritual discernment, and a spirit of servant leadership. This is not the curriculum itself, but rather it's a model of set constructs used to guide us in the curricular building process. Now, I've listed those. Number one, our process of study needs to be formational. We have the privilege of shaping and forming young lives. Number two, biblical worship is transformational. Likewise, we have the privilege of shaping and forming young lives. We have the privilege of, let me start it. We need to make certain that we structure our curriculum so that students' lives are transformed and changed through our skill courses, applied studies, and various internship and practicum opportunities. Number three, students must be given the opportunity to build relationships. This is building community with God and community with those around us. Number four, the outgrowth of lifestyle worship is missional worship. This simply means that building to our curricula should be the opportunity to serve, share, evangelize, and proclaim the gospel. Again, I'm going to quote Randall Bradley on this. The missional church is not focused primarily on the church in a particular location. It sends people into the world to be the presence of Christ and participate in God's work wherever they may find themselves. The missional church equips people to be on a mission in their regular lives, outside of the institutional structures of any church. The missional church gathers for worship, to equip the people for the service in the world. And number five, at the end of the day, biblical worship is reproducible. Embedded in the curriculum should be an opportunity for students to teach, train, and equip others to worship. So with this model in mind, what should the curriculum itself look like? First, worship curriculum needs to provide a platform whereby students can nurture and thoroughly understand their calling. They need to understand the biblical basis for their calling. They need to understand the opportunities, responsibilities, and parameters for being obedient to God's call upon their lives. Secondly, any curriculum needs to equip worship leaders as skilled music professionals. None of us would disagree with that. This includes a thorough dose of worship theology, though, and principles of leadership, and Old and New Testament principles of worship, and history and philosophy of worship, a clear understanding of creative worship, and a variety of opportunities to make application of learned principles to ministry. They do need to be skilled singers and players of instruments. The more the better. They need to be great conductors and communicators of the gospel. And then they need to be confident in their ability to work with people. Third, the curriculum should meet the expectations of any accredited baccalaureate degree, complete with studies in the liberal arts, the sciences, and the languages. Fourth, young professionals should receive ongoing training from practitioners already in the field. Ideally, this should include resident and guest teachers that have years of experience working as worship leaders and ministers of music. Fifth, the curriculum should be market-driven. It should equip students for specific tasks in the evangelical market. Students need to be equipped in areas of worship programming, musical performance, drama, scripture reading, songwriting, and program presentation. Sixth, any curriculum should equip the students to skillfully handle a variety of media technology. Seventh, any program dedicated to the training of worship leaders must connect with a local church. So after all, this is a program of study for the church. So in final analysis, God has called each of us to this room to equip the next generation of worship leaders. The millennial students in my classroom are passionate worshipers. They have genuine love for the Lord, and they are altruistic and selfless. They are wonderful, loving, and genuine. They tell me that they feel called to be worship leaders, and I totally believe them. I love mentoring them. I love hugging their necks. I love telling them that God is going to use them in a powerful way to change the world. And I believe that they will be used that way. And I personally believe God is going to use this millennial generation to usher in the next great awakening. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we're on the threshold of seeing God do some great and mighty things in us and through us. And that God is going to use us in this room to impact an entire generation for Christ. I believe God is going to give us the opportunity to place thousands of young leaders, young worship leaders in churches and in ministries around the globe. And that this army of worship leaders are going to yet again change the way the evangelical church worships. For certain, we need to ask tough questions. And we need to make difficult decisions. We need to roll up our sleeves, put our hand to the plow, and go to work. And you can count on it. Not everybody is going to like what we do. And even so, we don't need to give up. And we don't need to succumb to their negativity. Let's thank the Lord that the culture around us is forcing us to ask questions, make changes in the way we educate, provide new and exciting ways to communicate, and they're giving us a moment where we can honestly re-examine our calling. Remember, God has called you and me to respond to the need. Take courage, my brothers and sisters. This is God's work. And He will give us the ability, the energy, the wisdom to develop a new, exciting curriculum that will meet the needs of this generation. He will give you and me the determination to see great things accomplished for our great God. After all, He is able to do exceedingly, abundantly above all that we could ever ask or think. And it is our sovereign God that is calling us to equip the next generation of worship leaders, and He is calling us, and we must obey. Am I up here by myself now?
Well, David is I don't know if I can facilitate very much after that. Thank you for those profound thoughts. Did raise one problem or one issue that I think we all struggle with, and that is curricular change. And I don't know how it is at your institution, but to get a change in curriculum at Baylor is a years-long process. And how do we deal with that in trying to stay current with things? I'd be open to suggestions. Or do we need to change curriculum? Is it a matter of other things? And Vernon may have some ideas there too. Do we approach it outside the curriculum? Do we integrate it within standard or current curriculum?
One of the challenges that we're facing, and Eric's going to go into this topic as well, is this challenge of what I'm receiving in terms of the students, what I'm hearing in terms of what they are looking for in a degree. I'm also hearing from their parents that will go out and actually serve well within the local church, yet battling with a team of colleagues who hold to the old classical traditional church music program as the program that must be instilled, yet we're dealing with realities of this pluralistic and popular culture that we're dealing with. That, to me, is an internal struggle that we're dealing with. And I haven't quite found the answers. It's not even at the administration level, it's more at the faculty level in the battles that we're working with there in order to balance the NASM issues as well as the 126-hour requirements that we're all trying to get to in Texas or wherever. You know, it's the challenge that basically it comes down to the question, how much can we put into an undergraduate degree? Should we be emphasizing this at the undergraduate level? When I went through here at Baylor, I was told they didn't have a church music program, go music ed or go performance because you're going on to seminary, which we all did, but that's not the case today. So what is our responsibility to our undergraduates that will come and will go in churches without the promise or hope and the benefit of seminary or graduate education? And do they have the preparation to do that?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, is part of the struggle that you have, how fearful are the faculty that are guarding the casket? Because I mean, a number of us have grown up through various, the worship wars and things, and I mean, there may be a little fear, will there be a place for them?
I think that's valid.
I think that's part of the picture. Stubborn, part of it.
So-
Fear plays into that.
To address what David was saying, I mean, because we, I mean, at Hart and Simmons, we're looking at this also, at adjusting curriculum, and I think there does need to be curriculum change. I mean, I think we've reached that point where we do need to take a hard look at traditional curriculum. And thank you, by the way, Vernon, everything you said speaks directly to what we're dealing with. The question, but my concern is we're looking at this is that I don't want to be reactive, because if we're always reacting to current trends and trying to adjust our curriculum to current trends, then we're already behind we're behind before we ever get started. So as my dean came to me a few months ago and said, we need to, let's think about curriculum change. And his whole idea was, let's just change course titles and keep everything the same. And, my response was kind of what you said, that may do something for now, but I don't think that's going to be the answer in the long run. Nor do I think just in reacting and finding the current trends and trying to adjust our curriculum, it's about building a new chassis. It's about starting being, in fact, I made notes earlier before you ever spoke about envisioning the future of church music and how we can anticipate and project and set our curriculum so that we don't have to be reactionary and change it every so often, worry about NASM and what it's going to cover and what it isn't going to cover. And I'm not sure how to go about that. I mean, I'm talking with, because these topics that you're talking about, my degree and training, these are outside of what I'm trying to do. And are we going to pull in other professors to, team teach courses? How are you going to balance load, credits, things like that? And so it's scary for me, these things that we're looking at, because they are outside of my realm of training and expertise. I think I'm rambling. I don't mean to, I'm sorry, but.
It seems to me that, there are two approaches, and I think one of them is adding new courses, adding different courses, but I think the other one is just what we all do as teachers. Every semester you approach a course you've taught before, but you come at it,
Right.
you renew it, that 2012 BMW and that, what you said, 1985 Cadillac, both still have an engine under the hood and still runs on internal combustion principles. And so you're still teaching internal combustion principles. Now maybe you threw out a distributor cap you don't need anymore. But an awful lot of what you're doing, it's still a vehicle to move from here to there, and so we're not talking moving from a 1985 Cadillac to a flying miniature rocket ship all of a sudden. There is a lot still in common. We need to recognize that there are differences, but I think there are two approaches to that. One is, yes, the new course, and sometimes we need that, but others of it is recognizing these trends and realizing how that needs to filter through what we are doing and have been doing. Because we always are teaching a theology of worship. We've got to start there. We are talking about spiritual formation, and we've got to do that. Now, the techniques for doing that, if you got PowerPoint in your classroom, you can use it now. It used to be a chalkboard, okay. But some of those principles are the same. Now, then there are new things. If we get too caught up in too detailed, I'm afraid, get too caught up in too much detail on technology, in 10 years, that's out of date. The principles of technology in support of the worship service, now that's not going out of date. So the principles of communication are going to, and may very well be teaching that now. So I mean, I think there are two problems. There may be need for new courses, but I think a lot of it it doesn't have to necessarily go through a faculty review of curriculum change. We just need to maybe be aware of the content of what we are already teaching. And maybe it's application. Maybe taking those same principles. Okay, now how does that flesh out in 2012, as opposed to the way it fleshed out in 1985?
There are some courses, though, that I think would be valuable that we're considering adding somehow.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
interpersonal communications.
Yeah.
That's another field that I'm close to, and so I know the value of that course for any minister, and I recommend that. Spiritual formation, the course spiritual formation is so critical that we can't cover it, I don't think, to the degree that we need it, that I can cover it in a church music class. So broadening the sphere to incorporate more interdisciplinary kinds of opportunities does get into that question about faculty conferences and all of that, which is a challenge. There's not a lot of receptivity to that.
But I have to say, it's not either or. I mean, I think that both of those need to be happening. There may be new courses. Does interpersonal communications meet a requirement that's already in the general education in terms of communications? You know, is that something that, in fact, if you get a little help from the communications faculty, you're not changing the hours. It's just another option for all of the students. That's institutional. You know, it's not your problem.
Right.
You know,
It's all there.
I think the problem with that, though, is it assumes that students will make all those connections.
That's
If
right.
they're taking interpersonal communication here, they're going to connect that to ministry, and they're going to connect that to music, and they don't make those connections, at least not my students. And so they have to be integrated, because in their lives, they're going to be integrated. So if we don't give them that model of integration, they're not going to make the connection.
But I think so much of what we have to do is set new models, and I think those models have to, in many ways, begin with us. And I don't think it always has to be out there doing all things, but we have to model the way in which we ask questions, the way in which we're open to new information, and the way in which we're walking alongside each other. Some of that's some stuff I'll get to talk about a little bit this afternoon. But Vernon, thank you for a delightful presentation and for posing so many amazing questions. I think a big thing is that, and we've talked about this a lot in our curriculum revision, is that if you look at the church broadly, the church Catholic, nothing that church musicians have been supposed to do for the last 200 years is off the radar. Everything is still there in somebody's church somewhere. And when we begin to believe that we have to teach toward all of those somebodies and all of those things, then we can't do that. And it's just like our lives. We can't continue to add and add and add without pulling something back and without saying that will diminish in importance. It doesn't mean it will be not important. It means it will have to diminish. We also have to realize that people can't know everything that we know and everything that they already know or everything they should know. And we can't teach them everything. We make this huge mistake of believing that we're infallible and that somehow when they come out of our programs they have to know all things. And that's just not going to happen. It is arrogant. It's immensely arrogant for us to ever even imagine such a thought and to imagine that any one of us could teach it if we had the time and they were all our students and all they did was sit with us all day. There's no way, because mostly we're not able to do that. But I think an amazing point that Vernon made is that we do have teachable students. And when I've been teaching for over 30 years, and students that I taught 20 years ago were not nearly as open and nearly as teachable and nearly as willing to learn. And I don't have students today that are opposed to learning all sorts of things all over the spectrum. And that has not always been the case. Our students don't come to us with all of this baggage for the most part. At least they're willing to shed it a lot quicker, which I think is just immensely hopeful. And I think Vernon is exactly right that we are on the cusp of something important. And if we don't act and we don't do and we don't respond, then we will look back and say, we had a chance and we didn't do. Now, how do we set that in motion and how do we know our place in it? I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm certainly excited about talking about it.
There were some things that made our experience at Liberty so totally unique to Liberty. Number one, and it was purely intentional on our part. I'm not sure we were thinking long term at the time. We were thinking of how to manage. But we specifically articulated that we wanted to train worship leaders in the evangelical community. So we automatically limited ourselves to that box. And it gave us a great deal of freedom because we weren't trying to be authentic people. One of the best compliments I ever had I got from John Coates, the arranger in Nashville. I used to take orchestration from him privately, and he said, you know, one thing I like about you, Vernon, if you don't know how to do it, you'll go get somebody else to do it. Well, there is some freedom, because there's lots of stuff I don't know how to do, so let's get people around us that do it.
I think our question now, though, Vernon, is that how would we describe the evangelical community? And lots of times people come to Baylor and they're prospective church musicians, and if they're from other denominations, and they often are, they'll say, well, my question is, do you all teach Baptist church music, just Baptist church music? And I say, well, I don't think so, because I wouldn't know what Baptist church music was. I wouldn't have any idea how to describe that. I wouldn't have a clue of what that might be, because Baptist church music is all of this. So our larger culture, which we've heard about already this morning, calls us to a much broader context. And if we don't show that broader context, our students are going to hold us in great suspicion, because we are holding back from them in some way.
I totally agree with you.
And so how do we do that?
I had to put about 12, 15 questions in about the evangelical culture, because in and of itself, there's a great, not only just diversity, there were too many conflicts, so I decided to pull them out. But at the end of the day, I think what the bigger picture is are we really equipping? Here's what the mothers will ask me. Is there a job that my daughter can have when she graduates from here? Sure. They're a lot more pragmatic about it. And so what drove us and our Liberty was to answer that question. Can we structure a degree that is so truly market-driven that we know that there are jobs for them? And I know that's not the normal way to do academics, and I know that the purists sometimes will look at you and kind of snub us, because we've been in those environments and they've been snubbed pretty badly. But I'm telling you, at the end of the day, the parents walk away feeling like their money's been well spent. And maybe that's what we need to go back to. Maybe we need to ask ourselves the question, are we really equipping them? And what is that job? Right? It changed me totally. But Jerry Falwell had me come up there, and he said this: I want you to design a program that will equip our students to do what you did at Iowa Baptist Church. Well, I had 11 full-time employees there. And now I had an incredible opportunity there that most of us in this room don't have. I got to start with a blank sheet of paper. Most of us don't have that gift. But the difference between Jerry Falwell, he would let you dream and innovate and do whatever you wanted to and give you zero money.